the child care system and providers. So we will have a more formal thank you to Eva at our regular January council meeting. But Eva, if you're on, we just want to say a huge thank you to you. As you know, in our packets, we have the Raise Up Oregon Progress Report. And I assured staff that each of us would have read and memorized the whole report so they could use that as the base for the beginning of our conversations. And as we know from reading that report, there's been a lot of progress in the last year in achieving the goals and strategies outlined there. There are also gaps, and there are opportunities of what we can do in the future. And many of the gaps and the delays, of course, are related to COVID. So I'm sure we will be talking about COVID, sort of intertwining it in our conversations, both today and tomorrow. But there's lots of positive pieces in the report. The goals of this retreat are really pretty focused. One is obviously for us as a council to talk about what the progress has been and look at where can we go in the future, and set those targets for us, and then share that information with the governor, who is looking forward to hearing from us and our priorities. So we will be working on that, and that'll be sort of the final product that comes out of our discussions today and tomorrow. And we really want to be looking at the opportunities and sort of those leverage points of where the council can really make a difference in achieving the priorities that we lay out. You'll remember, council, that a year ago at our retreat, when we were all meeting in person, we developed a list of roles, and these are in our packet. It's on page 7 of the packet. And these are roles that we identified that the council can play. So just real quickly looking at those, you know, we're going to be champions or advocates for development of the system. We want to develop a common understanding among our partners, but also more broadly in the public about what is in Raise Up Oregon. What are those strategies and what's the long-term vision? We're going to identify these opportunities and barriers, and we'll be talking about those in a little while. We also want to remember this is a 5-year plan, so it's really that vision for the future. It's not something that we expected to be done by December of this year. And then certainly a big role for us is to coordinate and partner with the other agencies that are putting this early learning system together. And last but not least is to adopt rules when we need to do that, but that's not on our agenda today. So those are our roles. And as we continue to embed equity in our work, we've decided that we're going to start every Early Learning Council meeting with a land acknowledgement. And we're going to be using this document, which I hope you can see, maybe you can't. Sorry, it's the Essential Understandings of Native Americans in Oregon. And I think I sent a link out to this. If I didn't, I will. But it's a wonderful document. And we'll be using those essential understandings as the sort of a guide for our understanding of equity as it applies to Indigenous people. And today, as this is our initial part of a land acknowledgement, I've asked our council member, fellow council member, Angie Blackwell, if she would lead off the discussion, because she is a member of the Grand Ronde Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon. So it seemed appropriate to have her do the first understanding, which is from time immemorial. So Angie, I will turn it over to you with gratitude.
Sure. Thank you, Sue. Thank you for inviting me to deliver this very special and important acknowledgement that means so much to me. I want to start off by saying land acknowledgements can be really tricky because hundreds of tribes, bands, and villages can lay claim to various parts of Oregon. And what complicates this further is back in the 1800s, tribes from all over, from Southwest Washington into Northern California, were relocated to various reservations throughout the state. So, for instance, for a land acknowledgement that might belong to one of my tribes, that could be clear down in Southern Oregon. It could be all over. So you can't necessarily attach just the nearest tribe to where you are. When you're looking for a land acknowledgement, it could be a tribe a long ways away from where you presently are. And it further complicates matters that there's not always agreement on which tribes necessarily can lay claim to that region. So I'm very thankful that today we're not going to focus on a specific part of Oregon, but we're going to do an acknowledgement for all of Oregon, which means the hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people that called Oregon home way before it was Oregon. And that was a relief to me because I don't want to say the wrong thing either. So today, as Sue mentioned, we're using the essential understandings. And so the essential understandings are part of the statewide tribal history, shared history curriculum project that came about as a result of Senate Bill 13 in 2017. And so with representatives from ODE, each of the 9 tribes helped create these 9 essential understandings. I wonder if that's a coincidence that there's 9 essential understandings and 9 tribes. And I'm pretty sure that's coincidental. I'm sure that they didn't each just come up with their own. But that's really important because the tribes themselves helped write this document to determine how are we going to go through and create this curricula for the whole entire state when each tribe has very unique and different history. So I think that was a wonderful first step. So the first understanding, which is where we're beginning today, is like Sue said, since time immemorial. So that means to us that our people have been here in Oregon forever, since time immemorial, as far back as you can go, that we each, all of our tribes, each have our own creation or origin story, and that we don't believe that we came here from a land bridge or anywhere else, but that our people were created right here on this land. And I really encourage you to learn about the tribes in your area. Ask them, can you tell us about your creation story? But remember, they may have more than one, because as you know, back in the 1800s, when tribes were moved to reservations, my tribe itself is made up of at least 27 tribes here in Grand Ronde. They could all have their own creation story. I doubt that they do, but they could. So just keep that in mind as you try to learn about the tribes in your area. They could have more than one. But these creation stories are passed down to us from, for millennia, from oral histories. And these are the things that we believe about ourselves. And so I am so glad that they chose, this group that developed these 9 essential understandings. I'm so happy that they chose that to be the number one first one, that we believe that we were always here. And we have scientific proof too, but that doesn't matter. What matters to us in our heart is that we believe we've always been here. We have creation stories, and each tribe is very different, and our stories will all be very different. But I think that's the first key to learning about the tribes in your area, is just accepting and knowing that we're not all the same. So again, I just want to thank you for the opportunity. I love sharing about tribal history, and I'm not I'm not a master at it by any means, but it is something obviously near and dear to my heart, and I'm always happy to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie, very much for sharing a part of your story, a story of origin. And I look at this time as really a beginning that can be an opening for us as a council, but also for the public to just have a greater awareness that Indigenous people have lived here from time immemorial. So thank you. Thank you for sharing. We will move on with our agenda then, and as you know, the next item is public testimony, but I understand from Remy that there has been none written and none requested for verbal. So we hope the public is listening at least. We're going to now head into the breakout groups, as you know from the agenda. And we've done this before, usually when we're in person and we kind of go to separate parts of the room, but that's not happening here today. So we'll have two breakout groups that Remy will put us into shortly, not quite yet. So half of us will be in group one, half in group two. And then I want to thank all of our agency partners who are on this call with us today. Because they're going to be meeting with us, group one for 45 minutes and then group two for 45 minutes. So we'll get to meet with agency reps from each of our partners and hear from them what they see in the progress report that we've have in front of us and where the progress has been, where the opportunities lie for the future, and what do the barriers look like. So thank you, partners, for spending this afternoon with us. We appreciate your time greatly. And I know you meet monthly at least, so thank you also for all of those monthly meetings. That's how this plan is going to get implemented. It's a big part. And because when I talked to each of you council members in advance of, as we tried to put this agenda together, a very common unanimous theme was equity. And how are we going to embed equity in all of the work that we do? Obviously, Angie helped us lead into that this afternoon. But I've asked Carrie McCann, whom you all probably recognize as one of our wonderful build consultants, if she would give us some background on her experience through Build in working with and framing early learning issues with around equity. And then Carrie's going to be followed by Pat Allen, a fellow council member, who's going to share Oregon Health Authority's perspective, especially focused on racial equity and centering that. So this will just help frame up our small group discussions as well. So Carrie, with that, I would welcome you. Thank you and turn it over to you.
That's great. I'm just gonna share some slides, and Harriet Dichter and I are excited to be here from Build to support some facilitation of some of your breakout groups today and tomorrow. So you'll be seeing both of us throughout the two-day retreat. As we get ready for our small group conversations between council members and our Raise Up Oregon Agency Implementation Coordination Team, we affectionately known as RUAC, I've been asked to share a brief intro on how Bill thinks about equity to be really food for thought for your conversations today. Tomorrow, we have longer time to discuss how equity is and could be reflected in the council meetings and your role in the coming year. I wanted to start by saying that the racial equity work we've been doing with states has really been an 8 to 10 year journey for the Build staff, and that we really started with and focused with our own organization and staff development before we started to do this kind of work with states. And it's really reflected in what you see actually in the upper left-hand corner of our vision statement, where we want to really envision a time when all children reach their full potential, and that really race, place, and income no longer predict outcomes for children before they even gotten started on their own life's journey. For us, equity is really a noun and a verb, and I think some people are more used to the noun of here's an illustration of how we think about what equity is versus equality, and it's really the tailoring, and that not everybody or every part of our community needs the exact same thing. And that when we're addressing disparities, we're really talking about addressing the systems and infrastructures that perpetuate them. We're actually not making a comment of inherently of how one group of people is doing compared to another. Sometimes I was kind of reflecting that maybe plumbing here feels simplistic to all of us who are working in the early childhood space, because we're really talking about the complex set of services and supports that our community and state have across early care and education, economic supports, human services, child welfare, housing, health, etc., and how they all come together to either support and impact opportunities and outcomes or how they don't. But for us, where we do our work is really in equity as a verb. And so for us, this is really, equity is not this thing that's over here that we need to talk about. It's really the way in which how do we do our work. And this graphic that we put together that was in your packet builds off of John Powell's work. And it's really thinking about the 4 levels of change. And we really don't see these as linear. We see these as kind of interactive, and they impact one another. So personal is the journey that each of us are doing on our own knowledge of our history, our bias.
Carrie,
yeah.
Excuse me, Peter?
Are the slides progressing? I'm still seeing the cover slide.
Right.
I'm on the, other people see the 4 levels of change slide?
No, it's not moving.
No. We can see your cover slide, Carrie, only.
Okay. Let me just try to.
Now we can see it.
Okay.
Now we see the history slide.
All right. That's probably much better than the cover slide. So this was the slide where I was talking about equity as a noun and kind of the plumbing metaphor. And then here is where I was really talking about how we think about equity as a verb and the interaction. So personal is our journey on how do we understand our history, our bias, how do we explore and meet other people and learn and gain perspectives of how our world is for everyone. Interpersonal is really about our networks of people. Who do we have access to? Who do we interact with? Who are we around every day? How do we reach out and are around people who are not like us so that we're continually expanding our perspective? So this starts to show how they interact with each other, which leads us to institutional. This is where Build leads in, and this is where we spend most of our time is at the institutional level, because we're really thinking about the role of state government and state agencies and how our systems are or aren't being built. But really, institution can be at any level of our community or state. And it's really those entities that have power around policies, practices, work cultures that impact success for some people and not the success of other people, and how those are informed by our personal and interpersonal experiences, but they also have a whole set of decisions that they can make around where resources and supports happen. And then those interact together to create our structure. So when we think about how maybe our transportation system and our housing system intersects with how quickly we can access healthcare or where we can, or how, those things begin to intersect with the kinds of disparities or barriers that we create. We could probably spend our whole 4 hours on this slide. I want to acknowledge that it comes from the documentary Cracking the Code, and really why I share it right now is to really show you that on the left-hand side is kind of how the individual interacts. So it's each of us has our bias, each of us has privilege, and each of us has internalized racism within our history, culture, and identity, and how that interacts with the external world of the interpersonal, institutional, and structural. And And I just share it with you because Build's work doesn't start and end with a lot of the work that you hear probably going on around states around bias. That's certainly a part of the work. It's definitely part of our personal journey. But you can see we're really focused on, when we work with state leadership, around the interpersonal. Who are we hearing from? Who are we connected from? And the institutional practices that contribute to this cycle of where we can either continue and perpetuate our disparities or interrupt them. There's lots of ways to lean into and be of equity, of what needs to be considered and how do we think about the intersectionality of all the issues. And I think that's why there is a diverse set of the council members around the table to help bring us all the perspectives in Oregon that are needed. This slide is to really kind of illustrate why Build leads in and leads first with racial equity. And it's because it's our experience that our state leaders have the hardest time talking about this and addressing this across the country. And that often, if we don't intentionally think and talk about it, it gets hidden. So what this slide shows you is the intersectionality of race and poverty. And what we're used to seeing is those bottom two bars about what's Oregon's average of the number of children under the age of 5 that live at the poverty level or below, and how do we compare to the US in general. But it isn't until you disaggregate the numbers and see how it's impacting different races to really think about root causes and what are the structural and institutional supports, the way we set up how people can be successful, interact with this, and that can help us decide who's benefiting and who's not benefiting, and how do we change the kinds of policies and structures that we have. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because I think we could spend a lot more time maybe in the coming year on the kinds of frames that you might experience. These are ones that we see around the country of what interrupts or disrupts the kind of conversation when we are trying to have around equity. These feel very American, but they often interrupt and stop conversation happening about how can we tailor the way that we do things, how can we listen with communities and have them help co-design solutions that is not a one size fit all. And so I just wanted to raise these as things that we could address together over time. The other thing that I wanted to leave you with that we can spend more time with tomorrow talking about is the way that Bill tries to work with state leaders. This helps you see that we try to work with state leaders on exploring our why are we doing equity work and how do we embed it in the everyday. A lot of our systems, policies, data are framed from a deficit point of view and have a deficit way of thinking about people. And so we work with people on how to reframe them from an asset-based approach. And then we're really looking around a key set of strategies or behaviors or practices that state leaders can do. And we see a number of these happening already in Oregon, but it's really the continued use, the kind of cycle of quality improvement that we can engage in together about how do we best use data, how do we best listen with communities and those who are supposed to be benefiting from our supports and services to co-design better solutions, how do we understand the root causes that are connected to our institutions and structures, and where is it that state leaders have the role and responsibility to shift policy, practice, and investments in the kind of changes that we want to see over time. For today's conversation, and as you think about the progress that Oregon has made connected to Raise Up Oregon, I think my last thought for you is really in this third bullet on the left-hand side, where we think about that the most powerful way to work toward equity is the cross-sector, that each of the sectors or systems that support children prenatal to age 5 and their families can't achieve equity by themselves. We're interdependent, we're intersected in ourselves. And so there needs to be progress in each part of the system, but that's necessary, but not sufficient. So what's, I think, exciting, and what you see me list on the right-hand side, is that Raise Up Oregon made equity a principle in the plan. You brought together your 5 state agencies that impact young children prenatal to age 5 and their families. Your goal 3 is inherently institutional and structural change. The objectives and strategies that you're doing there is really about how you want to change the system so it works better. And a lot of the obligations in those areas are for all 5 state agencies to do together. Your goals 1 and 2 really are talking about the nitty-gritty, about equity in where and how and what services are delivered for whom, and really wanting to do better in those areas. And then I've really seen in the conversations, especially grounded in the recent pandemic that we're all living through, is reflecting on who's benefiting, who are we able to serve well, who's not benefiting from our supports that we thought would, and how can we make those changes. And so when you go into your small groups and kind of think about the progress made, the gaps that we still want to address, and what does that mean for our next big move, these are the kinds of questions that are not going to be easily answered today, but might inform the kind of reflections that you want to have today, and then where we take our work in the next year together. So Sue, I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. Lots to think about. And as you say, lots to incorporate in conversations today in our small groups, as well as tomorrow, when we're going to have time to focus on equity as well. So let me ask Pat if he would just give us a quick understanding of how OHA is approaching racial equity in your work. And you're on mute, Pat.
You would think after 6 or 8 months of Zooming that you could figure that sort of thing out, but
Oh,
you'd be wrong.
yes, me too.
So, thanks, Sue. First, a little bit of terminology. I think in the health space, for a long time, we've been used to talking about health disparities, and we're really trying to gradually shift away from health disparities to being explicit about health inequities. What's the difference? Health disparities are simple facts about differences in health. And the easiest example I can think of is boy babies weigh a little bit more than girl babies do when they're born. That's a biological thing. That's not an expression of any kind of a dynamic or circumstance that needs to be addressed, or any kind of an inherent unfairness. Similar metric, though, is a better illustration of health inequity, and it's the fact that that Black babies are more likely to die in infancy. Black mothers are more likely to die in childbirth, even after you've adjusted for income and education levels. That speaks to an underlying dynamic driven by multiple generations and present racism, microaggressions, stress, epigenetics, all these things that build up to things that can't easily be fixed even by things that we think ordinarily would, like income and education. So when we think about health, we're thinking about health equity. About a year ago, the Oregon Health Policy Board, after a fairly extensive process by its health equity subcommittee, adopted a new health equity definition for the state. And I'm going to read it to you and then talk a little bit about it. Oregon will have established a health system that creates health equity when all people can reach their full health potential and well-being and are not disadvantaged by their race, ethnicity, language, disability, gender identity, sexual orientation, social class, intersections among these communities or identities, or other socially determined circumstances. Achieving health equity requires the ongoing collaboration of all regions and sectors of the state, including tribal governments, to address the equitable distribution and redistribution of resources and power, and recognizing, reconciling, and rectifying historical and contemporary injustices. And I really want to dwell for a second on those last two pieces, the equitable distribution or redistribution of resources and power. Who's at the table and who do the resources benefit, and how does that get decided? And recognizing, reconciling, and rectifying historical and contemporary injustices. That this is a system that's been constructed to be the way that it is, and we have to take specific concrete actions to deconstruct that system. So after the adoption of that as an agency, we set about doing a strategic plan, and we established our long-term 10-year goal in that strategic plan as eliminating health inequities in Oregon by 2030. And we were all set to start doing the work of turning that into what's the work of the agency. We had taken what was a value, health equity, and changed it from something that you pay attention to while you do your work to it being the work of the agency. That's why we exist, is to eliminate health equity in the state. Now, the bad news is that was about February that we got to that point in our strategic planning process, and the pandemic hit, and everything went to heck in a handbasket. And then we were faced with a really dramatic demonstration of the system that we had all collectively created and the inequities that were built into it. Today, something like 37% of coronavirus cases, COVID cases, are in Latino, Latina, and Latinx population, despite the fact they represent 13% of Oregon's population. That's not because they're biologically more susceptible to the disease or anything like that. It's because economically, socially, and from a racial structure standpoint, they're far more likely to work and live in circumstances that make the transmission of the disease easier. They're more likely to be exploited based on their citizenship status, and thus be rightfully suspicious of interacting with government agencies, including public health, much less likely to have access to primary health care because they don't have insurance. That's all structural stuff that has built up that expresses itself in that higher infection rate. Black Oregonians and Asian Pacific Islanders have worse outcomes as a result of contracting coronavirus, not because they made a bunch of poor choices that led to having higher rates of diabetes and lung disease and heart disease and those kinds of things, but because of those same dynamics I talked about in terms of infant mortality and maternal mortality in the buildup of the physical expression of generations of racism over time. And so as a result, partly of the pandemic and as a result of the protests following the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, as an agency, we had been at a place where we were kind of stuck a little bit on were we going to be able to commit to a leading with race approach to trying to deal with health inequities. And through this summer, we've kind of sailed past that to a place now where what we're talking about is how do we dismantle the structural and institutional racism that are part of our organization and the systems that we work with, on past that into recognizing the expression of white supremacy in the work that we do, and in a recent data project that we're working on with a number of scientists of color around the Portland region. How do we decolonize data and the information that we have to know what we're doing, and who owns that data and where does it come from and what kinds of actions does it inform? But this notion of leading with race is I think the really important piece of how we're trying to move forward into this work now. We often give ourselves permission to not ever deal with the racial element of these inequities by saying, well, it's not just race. There's also, there are rural inequities, there are inequities based on gender. And it's not to say that we don't plan to deal with any of that, but we need to actually commit ourselves to leading this work with race and focusing on how to actually commit ourselves to dealing with these inequities. I think one of the first things that you're likely to see will be a push that we and the governor and others will make to take the concept in Cover All Kids, which is to provide health insurance to kids regardless of their citizenship status, and expand that to basically cover all people. Probably tough sledding, a lot of money, bad time to be asking for a lot of money, all that kind of stuff. But that's the sort of thing that I think we're going to need to be able to commit ourselves to do to bring this leading with race concept to the work that we do around health inequities. And that's my 3-minute elevator version of that.
Thank you, Pat. Wow, OHA has done a lot of work around this. I think it'd be great to have you send to Remy the statement that you read towards the beginning that your organization has put together.
I'm nodding my head that yes, Kate Wilcox can do that.
Thank you, Kate Wilcox. Wow, very impressive. And I think just food for thought as we go into these breakout sessions now. So thank you, Pat. All right, so Remy is going to put us into two groups, and then we will have different RUIAC agency partners with us in each group. As I said, we'll do 45 minutes with one group of agencies and then 45 minutes with the other group. And Remy will post these questions. The 3 questions each group is being asked to address. Where's the biggest progress that's been made in the different agencies in Raise Up Oregon? Where are the gaps and where are the opportunities of what can happen in 2021? And we'll have Carrie facilitating one group, Harriet will be facilitating another group. And then we also, I think, have David and Chris taking notes for us. So we can then put all of these thoughts together from the 2 different groups and have a common conversation. Carrie, have I missed anything?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so Remy, work your magic and we will go into 2 groups and come back in a while.
Okay.
Right, remember you have to put us in the groups, otherwise they can't happen. Carrie's with
You got cut off.
All right, we're back for an interim while we get reassigned, reconnected. Remy does her magic. So following this next breakout session, we've got a 10-minute break. And then we'll come back and we've got the agency directors with us. Each agency gets 10 minutes to speak and 5 minutes for Q&A. So once again, it's gonna be rapid fire. How you do OHA, DHS in 10 minutes, we'll see. We will find out. But won't be easy. But I asked them all to focus on what can we as a council do to support their early learning agenda. So hopefully they are coming in with asks for us, and then we'll decide tomorrow what ones we're going to accept, modify, decline, whatever. So should be exciting. And most of the agency directors are fitting us in between meetings with the governor's office. So you'll see them popping in and out. It's a constantly changing schedule.
Okay, everyone, I think we're ready to go into our second breakout room, and I will be pulling you back in at about 3:10.
You got it.
Hey, Remy, I got sent into the same room again.
Sorry, Peter.
That's okay.
Did you get your invitation to join breakout room 1?
Not yet. Oh, there it is.
Awesome. See you later.
All right. Woo. Nice going, Remy. You got us out, in, out, in. So we are now taking a 10-minute break. And when we come back, we're going to have our agency directors with us. And as I think I said earlier, some of them are popping in and out of meetings with the governor's office. So we'll start with housing and then health, DHS, ODE, and ELD. And we'll see if the directors are able to get here in that order. But once again, I want to thank all of you staff members who have helped in these sessions and explaining what's great, what are the gaps, and what are some of our opportunities. So you've given us a great foundation to build on. So thank you. And Carrie and Harriet, thank you for facilitating. So we'll see you all at 3:20 when we'll have Margaret Salazar will be here with the housing. Okay. All right. Hi, Margaret. Good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Hello, hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Let's see. Kali had to leave early because of a issue at her school. Miriam is not able to join us this afternoon because of a family emergency. George will be back at 3:45. He had a staff meeting to go to. So, and Colt will be here and Pat in between governor meetings. So we understand how people's lives get busy. And Margaret, we're very appreciative.
It's a little bit going on, you know.
Just a little bit. Yeah, yeah. So as I've said to council members, yeah, good point, Anne. Those of us who are here are the cool ones. No doubt about it. So I've told the council members that you agency directors will be joining us over the next hour. And we've only given you about 10 minutes to talk about what your priorities are, with a focus on what the council can do to support your priorities, and then have time for some Q&A or comments from council members related to whatever topic we're talking about. So Margaret, if you would lead us off, we would love to hear about what work you're doing with early learning.
Absolutely. Well, hello, everybody. It's good to see you virtually. I wish we were in person, but glad that we get the chance to see each other. And I was just reflecting earlier today on how normal this is feeling now, this Zoom existence, and that in and of itself is just a strange thing to reflect on. But great to see all of you. So I had a great conversation with Sue and Miriam a little while ago, a few days ago, to prepare for today. And you know, I thought it would be helpful to just give you all a little bit of context of what Housing and Community Services has been focusing on these last few months, because I think that context kind of helps to set the stage for what we're looking at going forward. So just bear with me as I talk through, frankly, the roller coaster of the last several months. So in the in response to the COVID pandemic, our role has really been to provide emergency assistance. And we have received as an agency north of $250 million in rental, mortgage, and utility assistance that we have scrambled to get out the door, as well as dollars for homeless prevention and homeless services. The bulk of those resources are federal dollars that came from the Federal CARES Act. Some of them came directly allocated to our agency through federal agencies such as HUD and Health and Human Services for existing programs. And some of those dollars were allocated by the legislature, either state dollars or state general fund dollars or federal coronavirus relief funds that were then allocated to us by the state. In addition to kind of the broad category of rental assistance, which has been most of our emphasis, we received dedicated funding for agricultural workers, for safe sheltering and rental assistance for agricultural workers, really recognizing the particular challenges that that sector was facing in the COVID environment. And then, of course, there's been this big emphasis on non-congregate sheltering, which is a term I had not heard a year ago, I'll be honest with you, but that's probably the word of 2020 that I've added to my vocabulary. That, in addition to doom scrolling, are probably the two new words that I know. But joking aside, it's a whole new way to think about providing shelter. And we had done shelter studies about what was the need for Oregon before the pandemic. And what we found was that the majority of sheltering has been provided by faith-based organizations relying on volunteers and some small nonprofits as well. But when we move to kind of a COVID prevention environment, we have to rely on things like professional staff. We have to rely on things like non-congregate environments and quarantining and things like that. So there's been some of these dollars are really going toward the sheltering need as well. Now, the majority of these funds are going to families and likely families with children. They're not earmarked for families with young children, but we know that the economic hit has been hardest on working age families because seniors or others that receive SSI income are thankfully often protected from some of these economic hits. So it's really these working age families that have been particularly hard hit. Now we're also really on the front lines and working. I see Liesl is here. We're working hand in hand on the wildfire response and recovery work. And just on Friday, we received from the legislative e-board $10 million in additional sheltering resources for the winter months, which are not specifically for wildfire impacted individuals and families, but just recognizing that in some parts of the state, there's this added need because of wildfire displacement to scramble and find all the resources that folks can to shelter people who are experiencing homelessness. The legislature also made funds available for a new model called Project Turnkey, which was quite the lively hearing on Friday, but they did provide some funding toward a model to help nonprofits acquire hotels and motels and convert them into shelters and transitional housing, which creates some more stability in this time of looking for non-congregate shelter. The other thing I wanted to mention, the overall context, is we've had a big emphasis on equity and racial justice. And this was part of our strategic plan, that we announced last year, but we've really leaned into that work and tried to find opportunities with these new dollars to do things differently to further our equity goals. So the majority of the funds that I just spoke of were required to go out through our existing funding networks to community action agencies. And I think we've spoken about that before with the council. But we also recognize that the most impacted communities of COVID, both the health crisis and the economic crisis, are communities of color. So we had the specific funding, as I mentioned, for farm workers. And then we also pursued a statutory change in the August special session to allow us to compete out our federal homeless assistance dollars. We received $50 million in emergency solutions grant funds. These are funds that come from HUD for homeless services, rental assistance, outreach, and rapid rehousing. We thought we were going to be receiving about $7 million, but the federal government has now updated its formula to include more up-to-date unsheltered homelessness numbers. So the bad news is that our unsheltered homelessness numbers are unconscionably high. The good news is that the federal government is recognizing that. So we received $50 million when we thought we were going to receive $7 million. So that gave us an opportunity to pursue a statutory change that would allow us to compete out those dollars, to be more intentional about what we are trying to accomplish, to really push our grantees to try to address unsheltered homelessness in new ways, and to be able to contract directly with culturally responsive and culturally specific organizations, as opposed to just going through that same network that is the standard way that we do business, to allow us to invite new seats to the table so that we can get new strategies, because we're just concerned that folks are going to fall through the cracks of the existing service delivery systems. So we are gearing up to compete out those dollars, and we'll be putting them out, we believe, in November for competition. We also were thrilled to partner with the Oregon Health Authority. They put funding out for community-based organizations for things like contact tracing and other sorts of public awareness and other work with COVID. And of course, a lot of these community-based organizations are working with their clients on the ground and meeting people where they're at, and they have housing needs. They have housing insecurity. And it would just be such a shame to have made that connection with these community-based organizations rooted in communities of color, and then have the client have to be sent down the street to another service provider when they have their housing needs come to the fore. So we layered in some dollars with that OHA funding opportunity, which was really excited. So that's a little bit of the context. Now, and I'll just also mention, we're continuing to build housing. So that's the other good news, is that we have not slowed down our pace and our goals around affordable housing production. Thank goodness. Construction sites did not have to be shut down. There was great guidance and support from the state to help, that those providers be able to continue their work. So we've continued to put out dollars, including through LIFT, which is our signature program for larger bedroom size homes, families with children, so that we've continued to make those awards available. But as we've been focused on the emergency response, some of our new strategic initiatives, including things that we've worked on with you, had to be put on the back burner. So I just want to own that and call that out so that we can talk about strategizing on those issues. The first was, we were so excited back, I believe, in late January, to have a convening called Build Early. And it was our proposed strategy around co-locating early learning centers in our affordable housing developments, recognizing we have this unprecedented investments in sticks and bricks for housing. What do we need to do to figure out models to co-locate early learning centers in that family housing from the drawing board? It was a great dialogue from both sectors and a ton of participation. And I remember, because I was shaking people's hands, that it was pre-COVID. We had identified that as a potential request that we could put into our agency budget package, which of course has to be submitted in the summer. We ended up shelving that because at the time we were hearing about the significant budget crisis that Oregon was going to be facing, and anything that seemed to be outside of our core business, we weren't getting the signals that should go in our budget proposal. So that was shelved. I would just note that maybe there's an opportunity, as we think about capital construction dollars in both of our sectors, to figure out how we can align some of those requests, support each other's requests, and where there might be room to do some of this work together, because there's just that funding gap in affordable housing to make those spaces viable for early learning centers. How can we put our heads together? That's something I think we could continue to work on. The second one is, in the Raise Up Oregon strategic plan, there is a call out for prioritizing assistance to homeless families, and particularly rental assistance to families with young children. With everything going on with our incredibly strained social safety net system, we have not pushed on our service providers to prioritize assistance to families with children. We have not had the capacity to launch what we had envisioned, which was going to be a statewide campaign toward ending child homelessness. That's what's in our strategic plan. And everybody had to drop everything and get into emergency mode and homeless prevention mode. So the good news is our rental assistance and our utility assistance and our mortgage assistance has probably prevented families from falling into homelessness. That's a hard thing to prove, but we haven't explicitly carved out dollars for families with young children. And so I just want to own that we had to pivot away from that priority, and hopefully we can figure out where we go from there. So as we look ahead at our agency budget, we're in negotiations right now with the governor's office, so I can't get ahead of myself. The governor's budget will be published in December. But a couple things that we've highlighted in there as priorities. So one is, the good news is capital construction still seems to be a viable path for the state. Folks recognize that infrastructure and building creates jobs. And if we're looking at an economic recovery, building housing is one great strategy to do that. It's a win-win. And so we're getting early signals that the dollars that we're hoping to put into things like land acquisition, affordable housing construction, are probably going to be prioritized by the governor and hopefully the legislature as well. The second piece is the individual development account program. So this is an asset building program that we run through an organization called Neighborhood Partnerships. They provide a match savings grant for households that are saving for goals like buying a home, education, purchasing a vehicle, a number of other things. And this is a strategy that's important not only to help lift families out of poverty, but as we've talked about with all of you, it could be a really interesting model to help folks that want to open, for example, their own in-home childcare center and sort of start a business to be able to raise some capital to do that. And so that is a strategy that we have in our budget as well. We had a proposal as well for something that we called COVID revitalization dollars. It's pretty squishy because the needs keep changing and our understanding of the needs keep changing, but there's an opportunity here to basically put service dollars out to community-based organizations that could be an interagency approach. So similar to the work that we did layering in dollars with the Oregon Health Authority, there could be a way that we could partner with OHA and DHS, or maybe we partner with workforce development and early learning division, some kind of service capital, job training, kind of meeting people where they're at in the most impacted communities that are really struggling economically, whether it's from COVID or from wildfires. So that is a very murky proposal, but there's something to be said about a place-based initiative that really zeroes in on some of these communities that are hurting and helps the most vulnerable folks to meet them where they're at. And then a couple of final things I just wanted to mention. We continue to work on reforming our homelessness system. I mentioned that we were pursuing a statutory change to allow us to work directly with an array of service providers and culturally specific providers. We didn't get the full statutory change. We knew that that was a big push in this kind of rapid fire legislative environment. We got the ability to contract out just that one bucket of dollars we received this year, but I think we opened the door for the larger conversation. And as we push on that conversation and think about maybe running a bill in the long session, again, there may be a way to open the door to different ways that we fund homeless services that would allow us to prioritize certain populations more expressly in our programs, whether that's families with children, youth, or communities of color. So just ways that we could think about working with you on that. We also have a proposal around our homeless management information system. So this is a data proposal to really modernize how we're tracking the data of people experiencing homelessness and receiving services, and be able to pull down the demographics from throughout the state so we really understand what's going on with families, and it's part of an integrated approach. I know that DHS houses the integrated data warehouse. There's a ton of work other agencies have been able to do. The homeless data systems are a generation behind what we've been able to do in other sectors. So we really need to modernize that. And I think that could be a place where we could work with all of you to think about the connection to families and early learning. So those are just a few things that we've got in the hopper. And Sue, I don't know if you want me to take questions now or maybe hold it for all the directors at the end of the conversation.
Thank you, Margaret. What a great overview, and talk about having to pivot your entire organization. Wow, congratulations on meeting the emergency needs.
I will just note that this morning we received an award from the National Council of State Housing Agencies. We had our annual awards. We won an award for COVID response.
Wow, congratulations.
We needed that. We were just in it for the glory.
So now that you got the award, you can, go on vacation. Congratulations. Sounds like it's well deserved. So let's go ahead, Council, and stick with Margaret and what is happening with housing and community services. And, you know, I'd love to have you add your perspectives from your own communities and networks on what you see happening with housing as it relates to building an early learning system, or questions that you might have of Margaret from the array of programs that she talked about. Peter.
So Margaret, your priorities seem absolutely spot on. Appreciate everything you're doing. I'm really interested in the possible funding for culturally specific organizations and how that grant program is going to work. So I'm hoping that information can come through the council to us so we can be informed by that. And just to note, if you want to know what it's like in Southern Oregon, you probably do. We're in a world of hurt. So anything and everything you're doing is appreciated and needed.
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate that. And one of the things I'll just note on funding, you know, kind of opening up our funding to other partners is, you know, we've been trying to manage expectations because these, you know, as my colleagues, agency directors here know, I mean, these community organizations are just being absolutely stretched to the limit, and we're relying on them to do a lot. So we're really hoping that we'll get some of those folks through the door to apply for the homelessness assistance, but it may be that we start slow and we start building the capacity and we start building those relationships and trust so that we can lay the groundwork for future years. But we'll be sure to report back to you all on how that goes.
Yeah. Other comments from, other council members, questions?
I have one. Do you see any specific legislation that's going to be coming up in the next session that's going to help with these efforts? Sorry, I'm not showing on my screen. I don't know why.
Hi, Katie. It's Katie Brooks from Central Oregon.
Hi, Katie. Thank you for the question. So I know that there may be additional emergency boards and there may be a special session. We don't know yet. I know that there is a proposal that Representative Fahey, who's the chair of the House Housing Committee, is putting together a proposal around assistance to landlords, so directly funding properties that may be struggling because of limited rental payments. So, you know, we need to make sure that we have a very strained rental housing system. We need to make sure that we're shoring up the rental housing stock. And I think that's the desire from that proposal. So that's something that I know is in the works. We know that we received some dollars for wildfire housing relief that were kind of a rapid response from the legislature. And so we are going to be seeking some legislative flexibility to allow us to deploy those funds in a way that has more flexibility and can be more responsive to what we're seeing on the ground. So that's something I know that we're going to be putting forward. Those are the things that I'm aware of. I think there will continue to be focus on shelter assistance, things like shelter siting is another thing. And then I'll just note we're continuing to watch the federal space, and everyone's hoping that there will be another COVID stimulus package that would expressly provide funding for mortgage and rental assistance.
Thanks.
Margaret, thank you very much. We need to, Anne, did you want to ask a question or comment?
I guess I just wanted to, maybe this is a little off topic, but Margaret, about one of the problems we have in childcare is lack of facilities. And I know you were talking about housing, co-locating housing and childcare, but do you have other avenues through your agency for providing the space for childcare facilities?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think part of the issue that we discovered when we had that Build Early Summit back in January was educating our providers on what it actually takes to have like a licensed facility. And, you know, have the space that's appropriate and large enough. So sometimes I think our providers think, and I see David sort of nodding, if I have my community room, that's good enough. And I could just plop a childcare, an early learning center in there. And I think that they're learning that's not really the case. And that's why we would need some extra dollars to be able to build this out and help because the funding that we provide is all, the major engine of it is federal tax credits. And those federal tax credits, you can't get tax credit dollars for the square footage that is not dedicated to residential housing or resident use. So you can't get that federal subsidy. You have to backfill that from somewhere else. So that's the challenge. I mean, I know folks are scrappy right now and doing makeshift homeschooling centers and stuff like that for their residents. I mean, we're hearing all kinds of stories about folks doing pods in their community rooms and things, but that's a little bit different.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. Good question. Margaret, thank you very much, and not just for being with us today, but for all of the work you and your staff are doing. It's obviously a very important part of the recovery for Oregon. So thanks for being here. Okay, we are next going to go to my doorbell. Pat Allen, will you tell us about OHA? And I will be right back.
Sure, and I apologize. I had to step away for some other meetings. I understand that you've got some brief out from Kate and from Steph on the work that we've been doing, and that they spent time talking about our success areas and highlighted things like Family Connects and CCO 2.0 progress and some of those kinds of things. Talked about gaps again around CCOs, around COVID. And then talked about sort of what are some of the next big moves. And so I really just kind of want to follow up a little bit on that, a little bit in a mundane way, and then a little bit in a more of maybe a bigger picture way. The mundane way is, we're coming into the next legislative session, probably almost certainly in a pretty dire financial circumstance, right? So we're coming through this summer having identified all kinds of things that we that are not just nice to do, but that are critical needs that we need to invest in. Whether that's continued rollout of universal home visiting, or repairs to our healthcare systems, more investments in education, whatever. There are just a ton of needs. We have, as an agency, I think 60 different policy option packages in the hopper for the governor to consider, which is an absurd number. We always kind of start big, and knowing the number will always get smaller. It never gets bigger as you go through the process. And I see Peter Buckley chuckling and knows well that how that works. But I think the first thing to keep in mind in terms of how the council can be helpful is to remember that once the governor's budget comes out, I'm in favor of the governor's budget no matter what. And you are not necessarily so constrained. You are able to look at different kinds of choices that are super, super hard, that she needs to make, that Ways and Means subcommittees need to make, that the process needs to make, and advocate for what you think may be better choices. And not only is that not working around the system, that is the system. A menu of choices gets teed up, and then various people go advocate for what they think are the important values, and that's the hard job that legislators have, is to figure out how to resolve those competing values. And so I would really encourage you to recognize that we're all making really awful hard choices right now in building our budget asks, and the governor's going to make another set of awful choices, and you should engage in that process. That's kind of the fairly mundane thing. I guess the other fairly mundane thing is the status quo has a lot of friends, and change has relatively fewer friends. And I'll use as an example moves we've been trying to make in our systems to increase accountability amongst various entities. In the Senate Bill 887 work, this doesn't touch on kids a lot, but it's around how to hold the healthcare system more accountable for managing costs as prices of healthcare go up. In coordinated care organizations, it's contracts to hold them accountable for doing a better job in behavioral health, including kids' behavioral health. And and services to kids generally with county governments and other local behavioral health systems. It's again, contractual accountability to deliver value for dollars and those kinds of things. And I can tell you, after being at this now for a couple of 3 years at OHA, it's great to talk about holding various entities more accountable. They tend not to like it and tend to want to push back a lot. And when you have the kind of political environment we have right now, there's a lot of opportunity you have to stay really vigilant to make sure you continue to hold the progress that you made in trying to improve accountability. That's the second mundane thing. Keep your eyes peeled and watch to make sure we're able to maintain the progress that we've made. The kind of the bigger theme issue though is and this is, I know, a little bit colored by the fact that I've been exhausted for the last 6 months, and that can give you kind of a dark worldview. But the pandemic is destroying a lot of things. It's destroying social fabric. It's destroying political institutions. It's destroying educational structures. It's destroying healthcare structures. One of the things I was probably most taken by surprise, as an example, was how quickly the healthcare provider system faced financial collapse at the beginning of the pandemic. It was literally days. At the point that the governor ordered elective procedures to stop to preserve masks and gowns and gloves and such. Now, lots of steps got taken to avert that, and I think we've averted a lot of it, although not all of it. But it was startling how fast it was. The social fabric right now is torn so badly. I should probably read less of my email. But my email lately has gone from, boy, it would really be great to get kids back in school, to, why are you killing my child? Literally, why are you killing kids with the choices that you're making? And people have been now so polarized over some of these issues that, and you see this now playing out, unfortunately, in the legislature. And I really fear that part of what we're going to need to figure out how to do, even before the pandemic ends, is how to put stuff back together again. And with the added layer, when you think about the racial justice things we talked about earlier in the day, it's not going back to where we were before, because where we were before does not exist any longer. It's trying to figure out how we're going to put things back together in a way that makes sense to go forward in an environment that's really, really hard to navigate, and that is unfamiliar for an awful lot of us. But we've got to figure out how to start doing that work, because things are coming apart at the seams right now, and it's unsustainable on the track that we're on right now. And I wish I could come with a happy message, and B, an answer to kind of what I'm teeing up, and I don't really have either of those things. But when I think about all of our work collectively for kids, for health, for communities, that's what keeps me awake at night right now, and what I think we all need your and everyone's help with. How's that for teeing up a dark few minutes, Sue? You're on mute. Sue, you're on mute.
Yeah, that was sobering, but obviously very realistic. And certainly it's going to give us food for thought, Council, as we go into talking tomorrow about what is our role, what can be our role in helping put things together in a different way from what they were, but put things together. And where are our points of leverage that we can use? And with our partners, it's all of us together. With the systems. So questions of Pat or comments? Yeah, Anne.
Pat, first of all, thank you for that message that is so uninspiring and so unuplifting. Wow. But I want to get to another dark subject, which is child abuse and social emotional health during these times. And I know that one of the things that you've been advocating for is for the CCOs to be more involved in behavioral health, social emotional health, whether it's the metrics and the metric system that you're trying to put in place and so on. But I'm wondering what you're seeing there, whether there's opportunities now to actually invigorate that, because we are all concerned about what's happening to kids at home with stressed parents, and whether there's some advice you have for us as a council on that particular subject.
Yeah, so I'll tie together a few things in the answer beyond just CCOs. First, the good news: we just released a number of data series about that are related to suicide and youth suicide, particularly that are either suicide or suicide adjacent around emergency department visits, those kinds of things. And at least in Oregon, the numbers so far in 2021 are not significantly different than the numbers in 2019. So, you know, the kind of notion of teen suicide is way up open the schools isn't literally true in terms of the metrics right now. Abuse reporting is down significantly, and it's actually hard right now to interpret that number. Because there are obviously two different ways it can be down, right? One is that there's less abuse, and the other is there's less opportunity to report abuse because there's less contact with mandatory reporters and those kinds of things. And most people would probably say it's more likely the latter than the former. All of that is why we really are focused hard on getting schools reopened. I had to step away to go do a session with the School Boards Association talking about revised metrics that we're working on rolling out that should allow a lot more counties to open a lot more schools for a lot more kids. They take the metrics that we first established that were based on some successful European models where they got the rate of disease down low enough that when schools reopened, it didn't whipsaw. And I would say our metrics now look maybe a little bit more like New York, which is 3 weeks into successfully opening schools. 3 weeks is an awfully short period of time. But we're more or less doubling the amount of COVID that can be in a community that would allow either actually now it's going to be K6, elementary, K5 or 6 at one set of metrics and K12 above that to open. There'll be more coronavirus as a result of that. There'll be more hospitalizations as a result of that, and there will be more deaths as a result of that. But I think sort of the trade-off people are willing to, their tolerance for that trade-off is changing as we get further and further into the pandemic. So that's also a big piece of trying to move forward. In terms of CCOs, I will just say candidly that they're pushing back really hard on behavioral health accountability right now. Now, in fairness to them, their pushback is not that the accountability is not right. It's that the way we're approaching it is too paperwork oriented, and it's about plans, not work, and those kinds of things. And I'm trying to dig further into that to see what we can try to do to address that if it's meaningful. But one of the effects of the pandemic has been to basically delay huge amounts of CCO 2.0 by a year or more as we've moved through the pandemic, because they don't have time to do this additional work. We don't have time to review any additional work, those kinds of things. And so it's a challenge. It's one of these things that's kind of being broken apart, I would say, by the pandemic, is all of this work that we invested over the last couple of years to get to the massive amount of work we made in all of the different pieces of CCO 2.0 to deliver a better system, especially for kids in behavioral health, but all across the board is really at jeopardy right now because of these pressures of the pandemic. I dare someone to ask me another question.
Yeah. Peter.
Well, no, I was going to just take off on that. I think part of the struggle is the behavioral health workforce, and just like the childcare workforce, it's definitely a challenge for all of us. And I wanted to make a suggestion that and you already do a great job of collaborating with education, Pat, but the educators who I'm in contact with are extremely concerned about the social emotional health of their students. Many of them are willing to, and they're wanting training, additional training. How can our K-12 educators and early childhood educators really skill up in social emotional learning and social emotional skills to help their students? So that's an area that I hope that we can make progress on, provide more training to more educators so they feel more confident in trying to help address the social emotional needs of their kids and families.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. This is an area that I'm struggling desperately to keep alive. One of the steps before the pandemic that we made was to create a position in OHA dedicated to the relationship between us and ODE and trying to figure out how to maximize the behavioral health investments coming out of both agencies aimed at the K-12 population. Through school-based health centers, through behavioral health specialists in schools without centers, and then through the investments in Student Success Act investments on the K-12 side. Katarina Mosley is the person that I've got on point on that. Of course, she's spent an awful lot of the last 6 months on things like school reopening metrics and those sorts of things. And the same thing obviously is true at ODE, but we are trying to keep that whole investment kind of on life support because it's just so critically important. What I've told people in our agency is that, a generation ago when Measure 5 passed, and I usually have to then look around the room and ask, raise your hand if you even know what Measure 5 is anymore at this point, and it's 50-50. When it passed, people said it was going to do what it ultimately did in terms of disinvestment. And the trick now, this is game changing. The Student Success Act is game changing money to reverse that. And our job is to figure out, can we fix things in less than a generation? And that's been the point of our trying to create a new relationship between the two agencies to maximize those behavioral health investments.
Yeah. Wow. Huge issues. Pat, thank you very much. We are going to move over actually to Colt, because I think he's got a very slim window here when he can join us for ODE in between umpteen meetings. So Colt, welcome. We appreciate your being a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Sue, and apologies for the very small window. It's COVID times and I'm meeting a lot with Pat and his team. I just left a meeting with Pat. Now here I am back in one. So I'll share ours, and I hope it all fits in context with what you've all talked about all day today or through your meetings today. I have 3 areas that I think are worth highlighting, and then one more sort of catch-all of some other things that I think we could work together around for Raise Up Oregon and where we move from here, as I reviewed where we're currently at and some things that are coming up in this time especially. So one of these is related to the State Interagency Coordinating Council. So this is related to students or children who experience disabilities, so especially infants and toddlers. Part of that federal program requires the state administrator to have this council that meets regularly and advises. So the members are appointed by the governor. Has to be at least 20% providers of early intervention services, 20% of parents, including parents of color, of infants or toddlers with disabilities, or at least children with disabilities age 12 or younger. And then designees from multiple other early childhood programs. So among the other requirements, this council is responsible to advise and assist ODE to identify sources of fiscal and other support services for early intervention service programs, promote intra and interagency collaboration, which I think Raise Up Oregon is a lot about as well, and to plan for transition of toddlers with disabilities to preschool and other appropriate services. And it seems like the charge closely aligns with some of the work of the Early Learning Council and your mission to coordinate a unified system aligned with early learning throughout Oregon. So it seems like it would be really helpful to have these two councils coordinate in different ways. I think one way could be shared membership. So we could have a member of the ELC be recommended from you all for appointment to the SICC. We could also have SICC member participation, perhaps on one of your committees of the Early Learning Council. The one we think about in that role would be like the measuring success and the child care safety portal committees. Those might be places where there's good crossover, if that was something you all wanted to consider. And then I think another one is to consider joint meetings. I don't know how often we would want to do that, but we could schedule the two councils so that they could share information and kind of establish what shared goals they have under Raise Up Oregon. And I think that this partnership might be, it's always been important, and it's, I wish we had moved to this sooner, but I think that it's even more important now. We're seeing a pretty significant decline in early intervention enrollment. And that's not something we've experienced until COVID-19. And we suspect it is because of reduced visits to childcare, which are the main referrals into early intervention. But it's down about 9% in the month of September, and that's pretty significant. So that'd be one area. Second one is around the kindergarten assessment. So you're all aware that this year we suspended it due to the impacts of COVID-19 and not being in person with our students for the most part. So it's a temporary suspension. We also know that this is one of the very few required assessments in the state, in the K-12 system at least, that's not required by state statute or federal mandate. So this offers us quite a bit of opportunity for the council, the State Board of Education, the division, and the department to collaborate and with both our early learning partners and our K-12 partners in the field, and kind of really dig into Raise Up Oregon's, I think, Objective 6, which is around children and families experiencing supportive transitions and continuity of services between early childhood and K-12 settings. And the KA has been named as a challenge, especially around the 6.2 objective to better support decision-making between early learning and K-12. We know that we have a lot of work to do around equity and the value challenges with the kindergarten assessment. We know it carries some value for early learning partners. We know it's not equitably serving all children or communities, in large part due to its language limitations. And we worry about its reinforcement of stereotype and implicit bias among the K-12 setting. So I think those are all things that if we wanted to pull together a team or a subcommittee, either across the agency and the division or across the state board and the council, if that would be of interest to you all, I think those are things we could also work on to think about how to improve and really think about the best use of the KA.
Awesome.
Couple more. So
yep,
one more significant one, I think the efforts in Raise Up Oregon under 6.1 are establish shared professional culture and practice between early care and education and K-3 that support all domains, including social emotional learning. And I think that we could partner and enhance this in a couple of different ways. So one of them is that we currently have a legislative concept going through and some other work in partnership with a couple of different legislators on long-standing efforts that we have that center on mental health. Our model is built in partnership with the Oregon Health Authority. It emphasizes strengths, resilience, and enhancing social emotional abilities. It's framed in our system as a cornerstone of education. So it's part of a continuum of care that's needed to support student learning, just like academic access is. In our model that we developed with OHA, it has 4 interconnected pillars of practice. So that it's equity-centered, strengths-based, trauma-informed, and self-driven. I think that this is an area either around these LCs or just thinking about the transition space between early learning and K-12, where we could do quite a bit of work together, which leads to the second thought. It's been several years ago now that ODE and ELD worked together with a number of partners to create the early learning and kindergarten guidelines. I was in a school district at that point and working heavily on early learning in Lane County. And that effort by ELD and the department really successfully sparked, at least in my area, quite a bit of shared professional learning and opportunity for practitioners in both early learning and kindergarten and first grade to come together and think about children's needs and student needs across that shared space. So if we were to think about an update and an expansion to some degree of these guidelines, I think that could continue to spark local interest in that Raise Up Oregon Objective 6.1, where we come together in learning and apply a more culturally sensitive and affirming lens to social emotional learning efforts. I think that could be a powerful way for us to bring the sectors together. And then I do have a few catch-alls if there's time.
Yeah, this is great, okay. Colt. Thank you.
Okay, so
go right ahead.
Okay, so 4 other small areas. One is we have worked with the State Board of Education and a number of community partners to create welcoming, inclusive, and safe schools for the LGBTQ2 SIA plus communities in Oregon that we serve in our K-12 system. And it's an area where there's a lot of need for learning and improvement, I think both in K-12 and also in early learning for the families that are served and for children who are even at that age expressing or experiencing gender differently. So we have a plan that was developed fully by community and students and are seeking legislative funding in this 21 session to support the implementation of that plan. And we would welcome Early Learning Council partnership if that was an area of interest. We also have our early education CTE programs. In Oregon, those now align and prepare students not only for childcare positions, but for early childhood education, pre-K and above, so into K-12 teaching positions. And it seems like that tightly matches with many of your efforts in the early learning workforce development. And I know that we already have some partnership there, but there might be ways to explore to deepen that partnership. And because now the way that we've designed it, it crosses the spectrum of early learning and K-12, it could also be an effort where we're working on the early learning compensation mirroring of K-12 systems. So I just think that there could be more there. We use Perkins funds to help support those programs of study in our high schools in Oregon. And then an area where I know we would be interested in learning is everything that's been done through OPK over the last few years could really help to inform our policy around kindergarten entry on how to provide the best kinds of supports for students as they come into the system. So any kind of sharing of best practices in that area, I think would be great for the state board and you to get together around and learn from. And then the only other area that I thought we might be able to offer something back is that I know that the Early Learning Division and the council have been working on a legislative concept to eliminate or reduce preschool suspensions and exclusions. And several years ago, we did pass similar provisions in kindergarten through 5th grade. And if there's information from that effort and from the implementation of that sort of prohibition on suspension and expulsion of kindergarten through 5th grade students, we'd be happy to share as it makes sense. So those are the areas that I called out, and some, clearly based on some of the conversation, Sue, that you and I and Director Calderon had.
Right. Wow. Cool. Thank you. You had a busy weekend doing all of that. I remember when we talked, you said that's when you were going to look at Raise Up Oregon, and
yes.
Wow, great input. Council, questions from you all, comments for Colt?
I'm interested in everything that Colt brought up. I mean, across the board, particularly the legislative concepts. I'd really, as soon as those are released, as soon as we could have a chance to read them, I'd love to read them and love to know which legislators are championing and how we could help with those.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm also, this is Angie. I'm very interested in a lot of everything that you had to say, really. I'm really excited though about some of the stuff around workforce development and CTE, and then also just shared professional development in the social emotional. I like what you're saying about the, what we might learn about the prohibition on suspension and expulsion in early childhood. So yeah, I took lots of notes here. I appreciate your time. There's lots of good work that we can continue doing together. Thank you.
And Cole, just to add on, we're planning a conference in August to bring early childhood educators, K-12 educators and families together. It'll probably be a Zoom conference, so you'll definitely get an invite for it if you want to take part in any of that. It'll be a day-long conference in August.
Great. Thank you.
And this is Peg. I appreciate your comments about children with special health care needs and early intervention. And clearly that number is not in reality going down, but I think it is that there have been fewer well child visits, and perhaps the ASQ has not been prioritized like it was amongst practitioners. I think the other kind of stumbling block is that it's very difficult to get assessments done to get kids eligible for early intervention services because of COVID. And I think like anything else, and kind of like what Pat alluded to, we've lost a lot of momentum in a program that I think was gaining some momentum. And those are kids that really, and families that really are struggling. So I appreciate your comments.
Yeah, Angie, one last comment, and then we're gonna jump to DHS and Liesl.
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to add on, I forgot that I wanted to say something about that, because I'm sure that the lack of the assessments is a piece of it, but another piece that I'm experiencing here in my program is parents opting out of services. So children that are already on an IFSP, already identified and need services, but because we're not in school, they're opting out. And we found that ever since the spring, a lot. I even offered to bring in consultants to work with families and pay for it through my program budget, and people still opted out.
Wow.
So yeah, I'm discouraged by that.
Yeah, we're going to have a lot of pieces to pick up and try to figure out in the months ahead. Colt, thank you very much for giving so much thought to this and for looking at ways that our agencies can work together and our councils and state board. And I really appreciate your comments about the SICC. You're right, that should be a relatively easy piece to pick up and try to improve our connections with. So thank you. Thank you, thank you. Liesl, let's hear what's happening in your world of DHS. Thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Oh, thank you. It's nice to see everybody. Well, thanks for having us. I thought I'd maybe take a page out of Margaret's book and give a little bit of context setting as well. I had my prepared notes, and it's funny to talk about prevention and forward-thinking things when in reality we're juggling some crisis situations. So, you know, I mean, I think as Pat indicated, COVID has fundamentally changed our business. I think when we were last with you, we talked about some of the changes to our workforce. Because many of you know, we have 10,000 folks all around the state, and we've somehow managed to continue services since COVID through telework and really trying to encourage people to apply for services online. And that's worked well. I think we found some positive situations there. I think one of the stories I shared last time, and it's still true, is in some cases, because of Zoom, some children are having more visits with their bio families, which is a really nice positive piece. You're not dealing with transportation and just all the time and challenges there. We've just revised some of our visitation policies as we've learned more as we go. I think we all thought this was 3 months and then 5 months, and it really is how we're doing business. So I think that's a positive. I think another long-term change that our vocational rehabilitation team is looking at is they've been providing services to students in school. And they suspended those, but they've recognized that they don't want to continue suspending those. And so actually being in touch with some of the SHAWs on Pat's team to really figure out how could we do some in-person services or expose youth to work opportunities, not in a physical setting. So I think the pivot we've made over the last 2 months is probably really looked at long-term. How are we going to continue in this environment? And so fundamentally changing our business practices. You know, the obvious pressure that it's put on our program is with aging and people with disabilities, long-term care settings. As Margaret said, I use the word congregate settings probably 12 times a day. I bet Pat outdoes me on that one, but I mean, it's obviously COVID's had such an impact in congregate settings. And so trying to look at how do you keep people safe and how do you protect the social and emotional health of some of those people who in their last days don't have access to seeing their loved ones in person. So really, really struggling through some change that we're looking at in that program. And again, we're trying to do our regular business. So we're actually recruiting for an aging and people with disabilities director. We've had an interim for about a year, poor guy. I think would really like to have a replacement. Mike McCormick's our interim and he has no desire for the permanent job. And we do actually have applicants, which, you know, brave souls who are applying for that job in today's environment. So we hope to hire somebody by the end of the year. That'll be a really important leadership position for us. Secondly, with the fire response, you know, as Margaret indicated, in some ways the opportunity has been that we've talked to housing and community services more in the last, you know, couple months than we did before. So I think the crises are really pushing different collaborations forward, which I think is a positive. We are responsible for mass care and feeding, and so we've been working very closely with the Red Cross and nonprofit agencies around the state to ensure that there's shelter and feeding for the people who are in non-congregate settings. So historically, you think of Red Cross coming into a gym or a large facility, cots and hot food, and that's not available in this current environment. So we've been relying on hotels and contracts with feeding vendors to be sure that people have access. And so as we look at, as Peter said, in your community, this is a game changer, and we'll be providing these services and coordinating with your local emergency managers and nonprofits and Margaret's team for months and years to come. So that's a big lift for us. We have had about 2.2 people dedicated to emergency management historically in this agency. So we've had to beef up that team because some of our team is working on COVID, and it's been an under-resourced part of all of state government, but we have felt that really it's been a challenge since the spring to actually have the professional capacity to respond to what the state and community has really needed from us. So we're adding some staff there. We actually just created a new acronym because that's what we do well, Social Service Emergency Liaison. So we have 3 one in Jackson, 1 in Lane, and 1 in Marion County. So the 3 counties most impacted by the fires. And what we learned in COVID and really taking a page out of OHA's book is they've had folks around the state that are from community, know community, and in community to be the first responders, if you will. And so the idea of these cells is that they're on the ground meeting with community action agencies, local elected officials, and really trying to figure out what do we need from the state and make those requests in more real time. And all of the cells that we hired come from, they're all representing communities of color. Most of have language capabilities other than English. And that's another piece that we've really learned is, just to be honest, emergency management and responders tend to be dominant culture. And in both crises, we've seen communities of color greatly impacted and really needing to make sure that the staff working on those issues reflect the community. So that has been a priority for us. The other thing, we just actually submitted a letter yesterday to give notice for an e-board request to cover the Red Cross expenditures, but also OHA, as Margaret mentioned and Pat indicated, have had grants to community-based organizations to do outreach, resource navigation, and OHA's case, contact tracing. Those grants expire at the end of December, and we would like to, I hope Pat knows this, but this might be news to him, piggyback on OHA's infrastructure and try to continue those grants to CBOs, particularly in the fire impacted counties. It's a great program. OHA has done a really phenomenal job making sure they're funding community-based organizations who really know the community and represent a wide range of them. And so we want to continue. The language access in particular has been an area that we've been challenged to have enough resources in community. So that's a big funding request. So when we get to the section about how you can help, it'll be things like that that I think will be really useful. The other thing I just wanted to highlight is we also have been fortunate and taken advantage of many federal waivers and opportunities to extend SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, to people affected both by COVID and by the fire response. So we partnered with ODE to distribute pandemic electronic benefit transfer, or EBT, in June, July. We have disaster SNAP available again for folks impacted in fire areas. It's a funny program that the feds give us the rules, we just administer, but it's a very short window for people to apply. I'll send out the information because the deadline is actually tomorrow. So I want to make sure, I'm looking at Peter in particular, you have that information to share with community partners to make sure that's available. So that's kind of the context that we're operating in. I think one of the challenges that that everyone really hit on is, given the budget environment, we also internally created a hiring pause to make sure that we could more or less make the cliff that we were potentially facing in 21-23 shorter. So that's been a little bit rocky internally to try to limit hiring while we've had increased needs. So, I think that's the tension that all of these agencies are going to face, is most of us see an increased demand for services at the time when there are less state resources. And so that dance of how do we be as responsive as we can to people in need when we have less and less resources. So that's just a constant reality I think all of us are trying to juggle. In light of all of this, we're also implementing probably the state's biggest IT project. So we're implementing one, which we've talked about here before, the integrated eligibility system, one-stop shop for families. It will have its next wave of rollout that will impact the largest geography of Oregon next week, day before Election Day. So our comms person is pretty excited because if something goes awry, no one will be focusing on that. But the initial rollout is actually going well. It's the system itself is working well. It's a big change management. So I don't know that we've ever shared with you, but it really is, when people are processing SNAP benefits in particular, it's a green screen, right? So people are using F6, F11 to move through screens. They're not using a mouse. So I mean, it's not just getting to the century. Somebody the other day said, "Oh, we're leading forward." I'm like, no, I think this is a catch up, right? So it should be a really positive experience for families. We're just going to need a bit of grace from community partners and folks as we go through this change. And it's, I think just in light of the current environment, it's amazing how much we don't actually talk about it. The other really significant piece that I think this group would be interested in, and we've talked a little bit about before, is the Family First Prevention Services Act. So over the last few months, we've had a series of work groups with internal and then some community partners really planning for that. And I think the significance here is to continue to work together is this is really shifting to look at prevention. So it's federal, it's not new federal funding. I think there's a perception among providers that there's new money. There is not new money. It's just a shift from where we can spend the money. So historically, we've really focused on that out-of-home foster care, and this is shifting to in-home support. So I think it's definitely in line with where I think you all are, where the plan is, and where the other agencies are. So there's a couple things I just wanted to flag for that for phase one. So first of all, we're about to submit the plan. It'll probably get submitted sometime in November to the feds. And the services that we're looking at are, again, initially phase one, are for families with children under 5. So one is parent-child interaction therapy. One is the Parents as Teachers program, which I think some of you are familiar with. And then some of the later phases are looking at Healthy Families America. So that's a home visiting program, Nurse Family Partnership, and Family Spirit, which is a culturally specific home visiting program. I think that, again, I think there's opportunity around prevention. I think the maybe the ask for partnership on this is that what can be funded with the federal dollars have to be in a federal clearinghouse. And so we anticipate that clearinghouse may not support culturally specific and culturally responsive services as much as we would like. And so there may be a need to look at some general fund resources for programs that we know work in community, but haven't had that scientific validation that this is best practice. So a lot of advocacy at the federal level around that, but I don't think that will be resolved in the near future. So that's a potential area. A couple other things I wanted to flag around self-sufficiency. So obviously that team is hands full with some of the emergency SNAP benefits, as well as the one rollout. I think the challenge that we have seen, and I think probably many of you, is really looking at the future of childcare. So many of the people we serve through SNAP, increasingly seeing on TANF, are essential workers. They're not making a lot of money, and they have to go to work. And if you're a single parent and you have to go to work and you don't have family, there aren't a lot of options. And I think that's a challenge I guess I offer to all of us, is sort of how do we really tackle that? You know, I'm optimistic with what Pat said, but that comes at a price. And so how do we look at maybe smaller settings, or really supporting family, friends, and neighbor care for some of those folks? So that's one. I think the other, we're partnering closely with the early learning to follow up on the recent audit and really look at where does the employment-related daycare program need to live, given the work of ELD and given some of the challenges that we're seeing in the future. So we're having some regular conversations with the ELD team on that. So just wanted to flag that piece. I think the last thing I would kind of just thinking about some challenges and opportunities in the future to partner on together. I think racial justice is obviously a focus for all of us. And, you know, to quote our equity director, we talk a good game in Oregon, and we're not so great at the follow through and action. And so we've challenged our program leaders. We've created an internal equity committee. We've made some plans. We've put deadlines on those plans. We're hiring a project manager so that we follow through on our plans. And so I think for all of us, it's, you know, some of it that is, you know, I guess I would invite, you know, some peer pressure that we follow through, that we change the dynamics of what it looks like to live in Oregon for people of color. And it's going to take a focus and commitment to do that. You know, as I mentioned, our TANF caseload is creeping up. We anticipate, you know, in the new year that to go up even more. To qualify for TANF, you have to be less than 50% of the federal poverty level. So you have to be really, really poor. And sometimes we make it so you have to be really poor until you get benefits. And so I think the other challenge is, how do we work across our own silos better? We somehow do it in crisis. And we have committees when we're not in crisis, but how do we take those committees and actually turn them into coordinated plans? Again, I think I'm an Oregonian, so I guess I feel like I can say this. We're good at the talk, and yet implementing it is really a challenge. And what we've heard from community partners who've really been calling us to task, which is good, is, so you've said that for 5 years, but what have you done, right? So for example, we've increased a lot of access to SNAP benefits through taking advantage of waivers and things like that. And then community said, how do we even know? So how are you communicating? How are you not just talking to your usual partners, but how are you getting out of your silos and communicating differently to people who may never have heard of SNAP before, who may never applied for benefits before? And so it was a good call to action for us, that we've got to reach deeper into community with some of the services that we're able to provide. I think the other opportunity is, and I've always known this about Oregon, but local level is where it happens. And Oregon is such a unique and diverse state. And so early in the crisis, we really empowered our local leaders to tell us what they needed rather than us telling them what to do. And that's been great. They're not shy, so they're really kind of open the door too wide. But I think it's powerful to invest in those local networks and and kind of have that more organic and regional leadership. And so looking again across state agencies for how can we create that regional network a little bit better. And then I think, I wrote down Pat's line, but where we were before doesn't exist anymore. And so I do think it's uncharted territory for us as state agencies to be a state when we respond to community. I think that's the other thing we've heard loud and clear from community is, I don't want to talk to 5 agencies, right? I have childcare needs in my community. What are you state doing and how are you showing up together so we don't have to navigate those? So again, I don't know that these are new things, but I do think it's a call to action for how we collaborate differently, how we communicate with each other and with community differently, and be sure that we're reaching out to people who don't come to us, and finding those audiences that are really desperate for our services but may not know that we even provide them. So I think it's been interesting to see almost equal challenges and opportunities. This has been probably the most change this agency has seen. And it was good change for the most part. So that's what I have for you.
Wow. Thank you, Liesl. Gee whiz. You guys, all of you are covering so many bases, obviously. Comments from council members, questions of Liesl?
Well, I'm always good for a comment. I appreciate the direction that the department's going in. Everything I interact with the local DHS all the time now, and they are challenged by the new system, but they're being committed to getting it done. But they are showing up constantly. They are making connections. They're really concerned about relationships. They really have the well-being of the families they're working with at heart. Just changing to be family coaches instead of caseworkers is a big change, just mentally. And I do think that that's starting to take hold now in interactions with other community partners. So keep going.
Thank you. We have some really great local leadership there, so that's great to hear.
And I wanted to just say thank you for pointing out too, for everybody's benefit, that many people that are on SNAP, those people are essential workers. They're employed and they're essential workers with no access to childcare. And so I appreciate you bringing that up. It has come up in other in the breakouts and such, that it is something I think we need to keep in the forefront, that there in many places throughout Oregon, there is no childcare for people. And if there are many people that are having to leave the workforce because they don't have a choice. And I'm experiencing that myself with my own staff.
Yeah, it's a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
You're right. Okay, Liesl, thank you very much. We are going to move to David Mandel, who is representing the Early Learning Division, because as I said, Miriam is out today on a family emergency. So David, thank you for pitch hitting once again. It's not the first time.
And let me just begin by saying I was unaware I was doing this until about 2 hours ago. So this really is totally extemporaneous. I also, Miriam had a family emergency that she's attending to, but I also want to apologize to Miriam because I know I probably will not hit on everything that she would have wanted to hit on today, but I'll try my best. I want to also hit on some, go back to some of the themes that we've been hearing all afternoon. I think one of the threads throughout the day is COVID has accentuated the injustices, inadequacies, and the weaknesses that were already in our systems. And, Pat talked eloquently about the racial injustices and the health inequities in the way that COVID has impacted in the system. And I think another place where we're seeing those impacts is the way that COVID has just even more deeply revealed the fundamental weaknesses in the way early care and education is funded and supported, not just in Oregon, but I would say, across this country. We knew before COVID that the state was essentially a childcare desert, that families were struggling to find childcare. When they could find childcare, it was unaffordable to most families. And at the same time that it was unaffordable to families, the folks doing this essential work were and continue to be paid, poverty wages. And that is fundamentally the nature of a early care and education system that's mostly reliant on tuition from parents. And, I think the current situation has just underlined those weaknesses. And then to go back to, I think, another theme that we've been hearing today, I think the current situation has also just highlighted something that I think we've always known, but also always struggled for, of putting the voices of families and also childcare providers front and center. So, I think, as we've been trying to, as the division sort of navigate through COVID, just the challenges of sort of knowing what are parents looking for and wanting in childcare in the moment. Are they looking for childcare, at the height of the impact? All those questions are really front and center, and I think have just highlighted our needs to really be engaging with families more deeply, more continuously, more honestly. I would say the other part of that has been that, the COVID has both challenged our ability to engage with providers and families in the way that we traditionally think about it, but also sort of revealed that, you can do things on Zoom that you didn't realize that you could do before. So I think there's also been opportunities there. So what is that? So I want to get to actually, what are some of these priorities for ELD going forward? I think going back to that, I think we were talking about what the current situation has revealed is we always know that early care and education programs that were dependent on parent tuition were economically fragile, and that working and contracting directly with programs as a financing mechanism is a way to support access for families. It's a way to provide resources to support quality, but I think it's also a way to address those issues around compensation and to support that supply that we know is desperately needed in our communities. And I think that's also why I think the value that the Early Learning Division has put around a mixed delivery system in which there are publicly funded programs, like Baby Promise, Preschool Promise, and now with our equity fund that we're working with a diversity of programs, not just centers, but family child care providers and culturally specific providers is so important. And, I think what we've been able to see is that those programs that are getting those public funding are more likely to survive this pandemic, and that public funding is really important. So, and we also know that there remain inequities in who has access to early care and education programs, and our public reach is still so small. So we did make great progress with the Student Success Act. We were able to greatly expand Oregon pre-kindergarten, extend to more full-day programs to work with working families, able to increase early Head Start for 0 to 3, and then also launch our new equity fund. But there's also much more work to be done in expanding that. So I think that does remain a priority. We know that finances across the state are challenging, but we also know that having early care and education available in the community is so essential at this moment for families to return to work and to support children through this challenging period. I think the issues around the workforce, have also been highlighted through the Student Success Act. We were able to start planning one of the first significant state investments in professional learning. We were only able to receive part of what we'd originally anticipated, and I think so that remains a real high priority, is to be able to make those investments in the workforce and work with our community partners, including the resource and referral networks, to really support those resources in the community for providers. A couple of areas that are also sort of priorities sort of moving forward into this next year is to be able to launch a tribal early learning hub. Over the last 6 years, we've launched the community-based early learning hubs as an important community-based partner. I think what we're really recognizing, and know we need to recognize, is the tribes as sovereign nations is a different relationship, and there needs to be a different partnership. And so the Early Learning Division has put forward a proposal for resources to be able to work and plan with the tribes to develop a tribal hub. The concept's a little bit open at the moment because I think we really want to be able to work with the tribes in the designing of what that actually would look like. But so that's one of the priority areas moving forward. Another area I think that it's come up is addressing suspension and expulsion in early childhood programs, particularly the racial disparities that we know exist in suspension and expulsion. And the Early Learning Division has been working with the governor's office on a proposal to really also make sure that child care programs and early care and education programs really have the resources and supports to get at some of those root causes of suspension and expulsion. The research points to access to mental health consultation for early care and education programs as actually one of the most effective strategies for not only addressing suspension and expulsion at large, but also for reducing racial disparities in suspension and expulsion. And then I think another continuing priority area moving forward is just around our childcare licensing and the work that the Early Learning Division is responsible for doing to make sure that children are health and safety in childcare settings. Over the last couple of years, thanks to a partnership with the legislature, we've been able to increase both our staffing and our legal tools to make sure that we have the resources necessary to effectively provide that regulatory function. And we know that's an area where there's still more work to do. So I think there's still work to do that we know, to look at our childcare licensing rules as a whole, make sure that they're really focused on what's most important, that they're written in a way that is really friendly and intelligible to providers. And then I think related to that, as we're making sure that we also have the tools to ensure that children are health and safety, and that we have the tools to do that regulatory function, that we're also making sure that there's the supports for programs to engage in strong health and safety and developmentally appropriate practices. So our goal is not to shut down programs. Our goal is to make sure that they're supported to be successful and supporting children and families. So I think as part of those ongoing reforms, we're also really looking at making sure that we're also getting resources and technical assistance to programs to support them to be able to stay open and provide quality supports and services. Last but not least, I think that support to transitions to kindergarten remains a sort of strong priority and area to, we continue on to work with ODE on that. So I think those I think were the main things I was wanted to hit on for today for priorities moving forward.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, David. Nice pinch hitting, to say the least. We have about 2 minutes for any comment that Peter might want to make or questions that someone might have.
That's a lot of main things that he covered. Lots of main things.
Lots of main things.
So can I ask a question, since David and Pat and Liesl are all just gave these fantastic presentations? So we all have known for a long time that a lot of the families we're talking about, that you're worried about, David, whether you're talking about prevention of suspension and expulsion from, early child development programs, or Pat, the behavioral health and mental health programs that you're worried about, or Liesl, the families that you're dealing with, whether it's in Family First Prevention and all the others, are probably the same families.
Right.
And so here we are, the Early Learning Council, and we have been empowered to figure out how we make some kind of coherence across all of these. So can I ask you, what's the one thing from your perspective, each of you, that you think could really help us align these things, that one bit of progress we could really make to make sure that we're meeting these families exactly where they are and supporting them with the services that you all know that we have? Do you have one thing that's just really bugging you, or that you think is really important for us to hear about?
Lisa, why don't you go first?
I'm never quoting you again, Pat. It's a great question. I mean, I think if we collectively funded community-based organizations to sort of be our communicators and translators and navigators, and said, hey, we're going to fund you, community-based organization, to communicate about OHP, ERDC, navigate the family to the child care provider, and help navigate your housing, and maybe it's the housing CBO that does that. I think if we did that collectively, it would be a game changer.
Yeah, I really agree with that. When we started investing this summer in CBOs, we basically said, what do you need that can help? And we got two real basic answers, which is, stuff that in my world we would call social determinants of health, childcare, housing, food security, all those kinds of things, and a seat at the table to figure out who gets it and how it gets spent. And back to some of the structural problems, we took that to CFO, Chief Financial Office, and Legislative Fiscal Office, and the Emergency Board, and their heads just exploded because what they want is line items that specify exactly how much and to whom and what kind of an accountability process is there. And I'm sorry, but money just rained on the hospitals, as an example. Without their needing to go through any of that. And to me, there was no better demonstration of, and this is streamed, so I'm going to get in trouble, but no better demonstration of structural racism in the way we respond to community and its needs. And we got to figure out how to change that paradigm. And I think being able to provide flexible resources to CBOs that can meet the real needs of the people that they serve and have relationships with as they present themselves is critical.
And
I when I'm in jail.
Yeah, and it's not. It's very, I'm going to dump on state procurement processes, which I know is really easy to do, but I would say that in general, I think state procurement processes make it really hard to work with small community-based organizations. And, you know, I think that's not something that we as individual state agencies are going to solve. So I think that probably requires some collective work across the state agencies to figure out, is there a way to, you know, I've seen times where we finally reach out to small community-based organizations, and what comes along with partnering with the state.
It's a lot.
Is a lot.
It's a lot. Right. Great question, Anne. Thank you for asking that. And it really ties into what we're going to talk about tomorrow, council members, when we talk about how are we going to communicate with partners and really on a regional or community basis. So that's a perfect tie-in with that conversation that we'll have tomorrow. So we are obviously almost out of time. Two things. I want Remy just put in the chat box the link to the survey that I really implore each of you to fill out. It's 4 easy, just open-ended questions. You know, what was good today? What would you do differently? What should our priorities be? So if you'll just fill that out, then Carrie and Harriet are going to compile those responses so that we have that as a basis for our conversation tomorrow for starting. Also, please remember in the morning, we've got the governor's early learning policy advisor, our dear friend, Alyssa Chatterjee, coming first thing. And she's going to talk about the Racial Justice Council, their Education Recovery Committee, as well as some governance issues that the governor and some legislators are looking at that impact early learning. So please be here at 1 o'clock tomorrow afternoon when Alyssa is with us. And thank you everybody for, we're leaving 5 minutes early so you can fill out the survey before 5 o'clock. So you're still on the clock. And thank you. Presenters, you've all done a fabulous job. And Carrie and Harriet for facilitating, and David for filling in on no notice. We appreciate you all very much. And hopefully we'll see you at 1 o'clock tomorrow. Agency directors, you are welcome to join us if you have nothing else to do. So, and RUIAC people, feel free to join us. So thank you all. Have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.